A bell tolls faintly past midnight, its sound swallowed by mist as shadows gather around a lonely churchyard. The air is damp, heavy with earth and candle smoke, and you notice the soft crunch of frost beneath your steps. This is forgotten folklore of midnight burial rites, a world where graves were dug by lantern light, and rituals whispered in the dark promised peace or protection. You don't need to follow every word, just let the images drift. Subscribe and tap the bell for more top history. Tonight, wander through the mysteries of burial rites long left behind. The night presses close. You hear the hush of wind folding through hedges, the distant creak of wood as shutters strain against the cold. Somewhere, faintly, a dog barks. Then silence returns, as though swallowed by the fog. The hour is late, deep past midnight, the hour when most of the village has long surrendered to sleep. And yet, not all rest. At the edge of the churchyard, a small procession moves quietly. Candles flicker beneath hoods, the light muffled so it will not carry too far. Their glow touches damp stone walls, blackened by moss, before fading into shadow again. The smell of earth lingers in the air, heavy with the weight of rain that fell earlier in the evening. The group does not speak aloud. They murmur, almost whisper, as though the darkness itself demands silence. You notice how the ground feels uneven beneath your feet, soil still damp, the grass glistening with dew. A spade scrapes softly against clay. The sound is steady, rhythmic, as if it follows a pattern known for centuries. For those gathered here, this is not merely the burying of a body. It is the keeping of an old tradition, one that insists burials be done beneath darkness, when no gaze from the living can follow the dead into their rest. The folklore of midnight burials in many corners of Europe. Whispers once told that to bury a body by day was to invite unrest. The soul might wander, they said, if too many eyes followed the coffin. To bury by midnight, when lamps burned low and most of the village slumbered, was to grant the dead secrecy, a gentler passage into silence. You imagine the scene, a coffin carried slowly through crooked lanes, its weight shared by weary hands. The only sound, the thud of boots on frozen earth, the muffled crack of ice underfoot. The night folds in, and you feel as though the whole world has narrowed to candlelight, wood, and shadow. The rites varied from place to place, but a theme lingered, that darkness itself was a protection. Names were not spoken aloud, only whispered. Candles were often hooded, their flames hidden from prying spirits. And sometimes, the body was turned or circled at the gate of the churchyard, to confuse whatever lingered in hedgerows, waiting for a soul to snatch. These were not just rituals of fear. They were gestures of care, meant to ease both the living and the dead. To bury by night was to shelter grief, to make mourning a private thing, remove from curious eyes. The senses of the rite pause for a moment. You hear the faint ring of a bell, muffled by distance, as though it trembles from a far-off tower. You smell smoke on the air, but still smoldering from the hearths people left behind to follow the procession. You feel the cold bite at your hands, the chill that seeps even through layers of cloth. The night holds all of this together, and in that stillness, the act of burial becomes more than necessity. It becomes atmosphere, something thick, something alive. Shadows of survival. Why were these traditions held so firmly? In part, it was survival. Villages feared contagion, feared the spread of plague or fever. To bury quickly, and often at night, was to hide away what might otherwise threaten the living. There was also fear of the supernatural, the belief that spirits, demons, or witches might linger if burials were done in careless light. But there was also a quieter reason. Life in those times was exposed. The body, the home, the village, all laid bare to the eyes of neighbors. Privacy was rare. Night burials gave grief a cloak of its own, a way for sorrow to move quietly, unseen by those who might gossip, unseen by those who might judge. And so, when the spade struck clay, when the soil fell back in heavy clumps, it was not only earth being moved, It was silence being kept. It was secrecy being honored. Reassurance loop. If you're still listening, notice how slow the rhythm has become. The scrape of spade, the hush of whispers, the flicker of hidden candles. You don't have to hold the details. It is enough to drift with the sound, to let the atmosphere fold gently around you. Rituals of protection. Folklore spoke of measures to protect the dead and the living during these midnight burials. Some told of coins pressed to the tongue, a way to buy silence or passage or peace. Others described shrouds stitched carefully without knots. 4 knots could bind the soul, keeping it restless. A body might be turned at the threshold, spun 3 times so that any spirit following would lose its way. Bread and salt placed on the chest could serve as offerings, both nourishment and barrier, signs that the body was cared for and the living would endure. Sometimes a figure known as a senator lingered at the edge of the house or the churchyard, ready to consume bread and ale set upon the coffin. A ritual meant to carry the sins of the dead into another stomach, leaving the departed lighter in rest. You picture it now, the flicker of candle against stone, the whisper of fabric as mourners shift their weight, the faint crunch of salt scattered across soil. These gestures, strange to modern eyes, were once threads of comfort. They told the living that they had done what they could, that the dead would not wander, that the house could breathe again. Asterisk, midway reflection. If you're still awake with me, notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to follow every ritual, every belief. It is enough to imagine the night itself holding the burial, carrying it away into silence. The persistence of belief, even as centuries shifted, even as church law frowned upon such customs, many villages clung to them. Old habits endured, because grief is not easily reshaped by decree. Families still whispered names instead of speaking them loud. They still buried by night when they could, still trusted that secrecy guarded the soul more gently than sunlight. And as you drift with these images, you feel how strong such traditions can be. They were not written in books, yet they lived in every whispered prayer, every candle shielded from wind. They passed not in decree, but in memory. And in that way, they linger still, faintly, in the imagination of those who wonder what it was like to stand in the midnight burial procession. Closing drift for section 1. The earth closes softly over the coffin, each clump of soil falling like a muted drumbeat. The candlelight dims, voices fall away, and the night takes everything back into itself. You are left with the sound of wind, the smell of damp earth, the faint glow of a sky beginning to pale with the first thought of dawn. And perhaps you wonder what other gestures of silence, hidden and unspoken, still linger beneath the surface of grief, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be whispered again beneath midnight earth. The night is never the same in every land. In one valley, mist curls thick around stone walls. In another, moonlight spills across fields in silver silence. You feel this difference as you drift further, carried from one place to another, where the same belief, the burial by night, took on many faces, shaped by the fears and comforts of each region. Wales, the hush of soul candles in the hills of Wales. Stories whispered of Canwell Corph, corpse candles, tiny blue or white flames said to appear in the night before death, drifting from house to churchyard, marking the path a coffin would soon follow. People swore they had seen them, bobbing low along hedges, sometimes 2 together for a woman, sometimes 3 for a child. You picture it, the hush of a village road, the faint glimmer of pale light moving ahead of you. No torch in hand, no lantern carried, only a hovering flame, silent, guiding. And when the body was laid to rest, the night watch was especially heavy. For the belief lingered that to disturb the path of the corpse candle was to invite death to your own door. So the burial by night was not only custom, it was part of a larger web of signs and silences where flame and shadow blurred together. The air there would have smelled of wet turf, of peat smoke rising faintly from hearths left behind, and always the wind pressing against stone chapels, humming low, still carrying the voices of those who had walked the path before. Scotland, the circling of gates farther north, cross moors where the wind carries its own sharp song. Scottish burials carried their own shape. The mourners, upon reaching the gate of the kirkyard, would circle the coffin 3 times before entering. This act, simple, almost rhythmic, was meant to confuse any spirit that might be waiting to follow. You see it now? The coffin pausing, lanterns swaying, the group stepping carefully round and round, boots crunching frost. The sound is steady, measured, like the beat of a slow drum. Only after the 3rd turn would they move inward, the gate creaking as it opened to admit them. And in that moment, the mourners might feel a kind of release, as if a burden outside the wall had been left behind. Inside, silence pressed more heavily, broken only by the scrape of spade or the whisper of prayer. And still, the air smelled of cold iron, of lichen, of earth turned by frost. Germany, the weaving of threads in the forests of Germany. Some burials included the strange gesture of weaving or knotting cords. A string might be placed across the threshold of the church or the doorway of the home, knotted in careful patterns. Each knot was meant to catch wandering spirits, to bind them so they could not follow the coffin into holy ground. But the shroud itself could never be knotted. It had to be sewn plain, without tie or twist, for knots held the soul, trapped it, kept it restless. Imagine the hush of a cottage room lit by a single taper. A woman bends low, needle glinting faintly, thread sliding silently through cloth. Her hands are careful, steady, deliberate, because to make a knot by accident would be to harm the one who lies cold nearby. You hear the faint breath of others waiting in the room, the rustle of fabric as they shift. When at last the coffin was carried out, the knots across thresholds were left behind to keep wandering presences at bay. And the night absorbed everything: the careful stitching, the hidden fears, the heavy scrape of wood carried out into frost. Eastern Europe watches in the hedges in the borderlands of Poland and beyond. Night burials carried yet another weight: the fear of revenants, of the restless dead who might rise again. To guard against this, burials were sometimes held in deepest night, when fewer eyes could follow, when fewer chances existed for the spirit to find its way back. Some graves were lined with stones, others pressed with heavy branches. A stake might be set through the body, not in cruelty, but in protection, to keep it still, to keep it from wandering. You imagine the sound, the crack of branch against earth, the muffled thud of stones dropping one by one. The air smells of pine and damp leaves, the night thick with fog curling low through hedgerows, and always, somewhere beyond, the hush of watchers, villagers standing at a distance, uncertain, fearful, waiting for the last soil to fall. In these places, night burials were less about privacy and more about protection, not shielding grief, but shielding the living from what might rise again. The uniting thread: different lands, different gestures, corpse candles in Wales, circling gates in Scotland, knotted cords in Germany, weighted graves in the East, and yet beneath them all ran the same quiet current: the belief that night itself was a veil, that in its stillness the dead could be guided, hidden, protected. You hear it now as one long rhythm: spades striking clay, footsteps crunching frost, whispers carried on wind. No matter the land, no matter the fear, the sounds folded together, all bound by the same need to let the dead go gently into earth. Midway reassurance, if you're still with me. Notice how slow the atmosphere has become. You don't have to follow each region, each detail. It is enough to drift with the rhythm. Footsteps, whispers, the hush of night pressing close. You don't need to remember. Just let the imagery settle like fog, soft and heavy, fading into silence. Toward dawn, as these rituals played out across centuries, The night always gave way eventually to dawn. Candles guttered, flames shrinking into wicks. Villagers returned home, their breath misting in pale air, their hands still smelling of earth, and as roofs took shape again out of mist. The churchyards held their silence, soil smoothed, grass flattened, gates closed. But you can imagine how the memory lingered. For those who circled gates, or whispered names, or placed coins on the tongue, the night burial did not end with soil. It lived on in thought, in quiet dread, in the feeling of something unseen brushing the edges of daily life. And so, the question lingers softly. Were these rituals protections for the dead, or for the living who feared to watch too closely, feared to remember too clearly, feared the gaze of what might follow from the hedges of the dark? The graveyard was not the place you pass in daylight, with stone leaning into grass, names carved, shallow and worn. At night, it was a different world, a world of stillness, where shapes seemed to lean closer, where every sound carried farther. You feel it now, as though you stand there yourself, the hush pressing tight. The smell of damp earth rising sharp, the lantern glow falling small against wide dark. The bells before the coffin ever reached the churchyard. Bells often sounded, not a cheerful ringing, not a peal to call worshippers, but the slow toll of a single bell, heavy and deliberate. Each strike seemed to carry through fog, pressing into ribs, reminding everyone who heard it that another life had ended. You imagine the sound now, deep, echoing, stretching long between strikes. The silence after each note feels heavier than the sound itself, as though the world holds its breath, waiting for the next chime. Some said the bell frightened away wandering spirits. Others said it guided the soul. But to those standing in the dark, it was less explanation and more presence, an anchor of sound against the emptiness of night. And when the bell fell quiet, the silence pressed thicker still, as though the earth itself listened. The lanterns' churchyards were not flooded with light. Only a few lanterns swung from poles, carried by mourners or set along the path. The light was never steady. It bent and wavered, throwing long shadows that swayed across the ground. You can almost see it, the glimmer of flame inside glass, rattling with every step, the shadow of iron gates stretching long across frost. Sometimes the lantern lit carved stone, catching names and dates for just a moment before slipping away into dark again. And in that half-light, everything seemed alive. Tree branches moving, ivy curling closer, the suggestion of figures where none stood. But the mourners pressed on, the lantern glow guiding, fragile but enough, like stars fallen low into human hands. The watchers, not everyone present, carried the coffin or dug the grave. Some stood apart, cloaked, silent, keeping their distance. These watchers were not always mourners. Sometimes they were neighbors, drawn by custom, by duty, by fear. To watch the burial at night was a way of ensuring it was done properly, that nothing was missed, that no spirit would be left wandering. You picture them now, faces hidden, breath curling white in air, hands clasped tight. They spoke little. Their presence itself was the ritual, a weight of eyes in the dark, and the coffin bearers felt them, though no words passed, the sense of being seen, of being measured, of the act being shared with those unseen as much as with those standing close. The earth at last came the sound of spade against soil, not quick, not careless, but slow, heavy, each strike echoing in the stillness. The earth gave way reluctantly, clay sticking, roots resisting, and every fall of soil afterward carried its own sound, muffled, final, soft against the wood of the coffin. You hear it now, the scrape, the pause, the thud, repeated again and again, fading slowly into silence. The smell of earth filled the air, damp and metallic, clinging to hands, to fabric, to memory. It was the smell of finality, though the rite itself was wrapped in softness. The soil covering not with haste, but with a kind of weary care. Asterisk. The fears all around lingered, the fear that the dead might not stay still. Too many tales told of bodies rising, of voices carried back on wind. Some mourners crossed themselves with every spadeful. Others whispered prayers under breath, words not meant to be heard, but meant to protect. You can imagine the weight of those fears. A rustle in hedges mistaken for footsteps. Branch snapping like bone. The long pause when soil shifted unexpectedly. And yet the burial continued, steady and deliberate, as though to stop halfway would invite the very thing they feared most. The silence afterward, when the last soil was pressed smooth, when the lanterns dimmed, when the watchers turned away. Silence felt deeper than before. The graveyard seemed to hold its breath again. Only the faint smell of extinguished candles lingered, sharp and smoky in the cool air. For those walking home, the silence followed. Each step along the path seemed louder than it should, each shadow longer, and behind them, the churchyard kept its vigil, the new mound blending slowly into the rhythm of stone and grass. Midway reassurance, if you're still listening, notice how slowly time moves here. You don't need to follow each step of the burial, each turn of custom. It is enough to let the rhythm of spade, of bell, of lantern drift past you. You don't have to remember. You only need to drift with the sound. Reflection. The night burial was more than ritual. It was a mirror of human fear and tenderness bound together. The darkness gave space for grief, but it also gave space for dread. Every flame seemed smaller in it, every sound heavier. And yet, across centuries, people chose it. They chose to gather in stillness, to move through night, to lay their dead into earth while the rest of the world slept. Perhaps it was to shield the living from sorrow. Perhaps to shield the dead from wandering eyes. Perhaps simply because, in the silence of midnight, the passage between life and death felt thinner, felt nearer, felt less abrupt, felt nearer, felt less abrupt. And so, the question lingers in the quiet. Did the night bury the dead, or did it bury the fears of the living, folded into earth alongside the bodies they laid down? You hear the hush of a countryside evening, not the crowded city, but the edge of a village where fields lie quiet and hills press low against the horizon. There is the smell of damp grass after a day's rain, and the faint sound of cattle shifting in their stalls. Beyond these simple sounds, the silence of the houses deepens. For tonight, there is a funeral, and death has brushed its shadow across the parish. Inside one small cottage, candles flicker low. Their flames bend and stretch, catching against the whitewashed walls in the faint smoke of peat fire. The air is close, heavy with the smell of bread that has just been baked and the sharper scent of ale. On the table rests a loaf, coarse and plain, and beside it, a wooden cup. They are not a meal for the mourners, not offerings of comfort for the grieving. They are set out for one person alone, the Sidnita. The arrival you hear, the door creak, the sound of boots against packed earth, and the quiet murmur of those inside. The senator enters, hood drawn, face half hidden. He is not welcomed warmly. He is tolerated, perhaps feared, but also needed. No one greets him as a guest. No one lingers too close. The air shifts slightly as he steps into the candlelight. Children are drawn back by their mothers, and men cross themselves under their breath. For this figure carries a strange burden. He is the one who will eat what the dead cannot, who will swallow sins that should not linger. The ritual, the body lies near, shrouded, pale in its stillness. A candle rests by its head, another by its feet. Between them, shadows pulled across the boards of the floor. You can almost see it now, the stillness of the dead, the wavering glow of the living, and the loaf waiting in silence. The senator sits alone beside the bread and ale. He does not pray loudly. He does not speak to the mourners. Instead, he mutters words low, words blurred by age and secrecy. Words whose meaning has long slipped beyond full understanding. Then he takes the bread and slowly, deliberately eats. Each bite is heavy. The crust cracks. The inside is is coarse. He chews slowly, as though each mouthful carries more than flour and water. The ale follows. The cup is raised, tilted back. The liquid glimmers briefly in the candlelight before it is swallowed down, another burden taken into flesh. For those who watch, the act is more than simple eating. It is a transaction. The sins of the dead are drawn into the bread, into the ale, into the body of the one who consumes them. The dead may rest lighter. The living may rest easier. But the senator, he carries what others would not. The weight you can imagine the silence after. The senator does not linger. He pushes the cup aside, wipes the crumbs from his hands, and lowers his hood further over his face. His task is done. The family presses a small coin into his palm, or perhaps a crust of food for his own table. Payment, but never gratitude. And then he goes. Asterisk, the air in the cottage seems to breathe easier as he leaves, as though his presence carried something that pressed on the chest, something no one wished to name. And yet, the family is comforted. They believe their dead has passed with less burden. The soul is freer. The sins have been taken away. But taken where? And to whom? And what becomes of the one who eats them? A figure apart, the senator was always apart from the village. He lived on the edge, in a hut by the woods, or by the river where few others went. He was rarely invited to feasts, rarely welcomed into taverns. His presence was a reminder of death, of guilt, of things unseen. And yet, when death came, people called for him. They needed him. They whispered his name, sent someone to fetch him, placed bread and ale on the table. He might be shunned in life, but in death's shadow, he became essential. You can picture him now, walking the narrow lanes at dusk, moving like a shadow, neither fully inside nor outside the life of the parish. Children watched him with wide eyes, uncertain if he was a man or something else. Adults avoided his gaze. His life was lonely, shaped by the burden he carried, but bound to the community that could never fully embrace him. The burden of memory. Imagine what it must have been to carry the weight of so many. Every loaf consumed, every cup drained, was another life's sorrow, another unspoken wrong. Did he feel them gathering inside him, heavy as stones? Did dreams trouble him at night, filled with voices that were not his own? The folklore whispered that senators aged faster, that their eyes dimmed, that their bodies bent under invisible weight. Some even said their souls would never find peace, that by taking sins from others, they ensured their own damnation. And yet, the work continued. Generation after generation, senators were called, each one taking on the role, each one vanishing slowly from memory except for the faint record in whispers, in fragments of song, in half-remembered tales. Midway reassurance, if you're still listening. Notice how time feels slower now, as though the candles burn more softly, as though the air itself has thickened around you. You don't need to hold every detail of the bread, the ale, the quiet figure who consumed them. It's enough to let the images drift, as though you two watch from the edge of the room, saying nothing, letting the ritual pass before you like mist across a field. Human meaning for the families who called him. The ritual was not superstition alone. It was comfort. It was a way to imagine the dead resting lighter, to feel that guilt had been given form, carried away by someone else. In this way, the senator was both feared and loved, shunned and needed. And for the senator himself, perhaps it was survival, a way to eat when food was scarce, a way to earn when work was little, a way to exist on the edge of society, half in shadow, half in service. It is difficult to know whether he believed what others believed. Did he truly think he carried the weight of sins, or was he simply performing what others required? Either way, the act was real to those who saw it, real to those who felt lighter when the bread was gone and the ale drained. The lingering question, the senator, fades into history, into the margins of record. His name is rarely written, his face rarely described. He exists mostly as an echo, a shadow in folklore, a reminder of a time when guilt and salvation were given shape through simple food. And so, the question remains, hanging like a candle flame in still air, did he truly take the sins of the dead? Or did the living simply need to believe it, to breathe easier in the silence of loss? Dear, in the silence of loss, you hear the hush of a night that seems to stretch longer than the day. The air is cool, damp, and still. Somewhere far off, a dog barks and falls silent again. Closer, you hear the shifting creak of wood, as though a cart has been left standing too long, its wheels settling into the earth. In that emptiness, you imagine the life of the senator, always hovering on the edges, always within sight, yet never truly within reach. A figure at the margins for those who lived in villages where the custom was known. The senator was both servant and warning. You see him moving along the path, shoulders bent, hood low, carrying not tools of farming, not baskets of goods for trade, but only himself. He was not a man people visited willingly. His hut, often little more than timber and sod, stood apart from the cluster of cottages. Smoke rose rarely from his fire, and if he entered the market square, voices dropped and footsteps drew aside. Children were told not to look at him too long. They were warned that a glance held too steadily might let some part of a stranger's soul cross over. Mothers tugged them away. Fathers muttered the sign of the cross. And yet, when death came, when a body lay stilled in its shroud, there was always someone sent down the lane to knock upon his door. The double gaze here can almost sense the tension. Villagers would not sit beside him at a feast, would not offer him drink in the tavern, would not speak his name at festivals. Yet, in moments of deepest need, they gave him bread and ale, silver and coin, and asked him to shoulder the burdens they feared. It is as though he carried two faces at once. To the living, he was cursed. To the dead, he was necessary. He lived in a strange shadow between. Ritual whispers folklore. It tells that the words he muttered during his task were not always prayers that a priest would bless. Some said they were half-remembered charms, fragments of older rites that lingered from before Christianity spread fully through the valleys. Perhaps they carried echoes of pagan speech, perhaps only garbled phrases passed down by word of mouth when he chewed the bread. The sound of crust breaking felt heavy, as though sins cracked with each bite. When he drank the ale, the silence in the room deepened, as though all eyes pressed toward that single act. And when he pushed back the cup, a sigh sometimes slipped through the watcher's relief. Fear, or both. Fear of touch villagers, feared to brush against him, even in passing. It was whispered that his hands carried the heaviness of those whose sins he had swallowed, that if he touched your shoulder, some weight might pass into you. For this reason, few would ever stand close, even as they needed him, and so he was left to his loneliness. The coins he gathered were enough for survival, but not for comfort. The work fed him, but it did not sustain him. The ritual gave him purpose, but not belonging. After death, what became of a senator when his own time came? This question lingered like smoke in the rafters of a cottage. Some whispered that his body could not be buried in holy ground, that no priest would welcome him into consecrated earth. Others claimed that when he died, the sins he had consumed spilled back into the air, haunting those who had once thought themselves freed. And yet, a few believed differently. They said that in taking on the weight of others, he performed a kind of hidden sacrifice, one not written in scripture, but carried out in silence. Perhaps his soul was not condemned, but lifted, cleansed by his strange duty. But no one knew for certain. And so his story ended as it began, with mystery, shadow, and silence. Midway Riankarif, you are still listening. Notice how the pace of the story has slowed. You don't need to hold on to every word. You don't need to decide whether the senator was cursed or blessed. It's enough just to hear the rhythm of his life, drifting past like footsteps fading into a night lane. Time feels slower now, like breath fogging in cool air. Echoes of older custom scholars today. wondered whether the practice of sin eating was a survival of something older, a fragment of belief carried forward from times before written record. The act of eating and drinking for the dead is found in many places, in many centuries. Offerings left at graves, feasts shared with the departed, rituals where food became the bridge between living and lost. In this light, the senator may have been less a Christian outcast and more a vessel of ancient memory, a figure carrying echoes of rites no one fully remembered, yet no one fully let go. And so, what appeared to be a strange and fearful superstition may in fact have been a quiet continuity, a thread stretched thin but unbroken, binding generations through bread, ale, and silence. The lingering presence even after the custom faded, whispers of sanitas remained. In certain valleys, their names were spoken softly, as though part of the earth itself remembered. Travelers wrote of them, half in disbelief, half in wonder. And though no one calls for such a figure now, the image lingers, a hooded man, bent low, chewing slowly in the dim light, carrying away what others feared to keep. And perhaps that image remains because it answers something deeper. The need to imagine sins removed, to believe burdens can be lifted, to hope that shadows can be swallowed, so that others may rest lighter. An unresolved reflection, you imagine again the candlelit room, the loaf broken, the ale drained, the figure stepping into the night with no one to thank him. The silence folds in after he leaves, and the family breathes easier. But somewhere beyond the hedges, the senator walks alone, carrying what cannot be seen. And so, the question drifts quietly, as soft as the smoke above a dying fire, who truly bore the greater weight, the dead, the living, or the one who ate their shadows? Asterisk, the night is still. You hear the low creak of a gate, iron against stone, followed by the soft shuffle of feet along a path. Lanterns flicker in the damp air. A coffin rests heavy on shoulders, wrapped and bound, moving slowly toward the waiting ground, and somewhere in the shadows, a figure lingers, the senator, called to perform the strange task that few dared watch, yet all believed must be done. 2 rites meetings. Sometimes the burial and the eating came together. The coffin was carried at night, as bells tolled slow and hollow, and within the same hush, bread and ale were placed across the still body. The senator stood, not at the altar, not at the grave's edge, but at the threshold between them. You picture him now, bent figure, lantern light catching the curve of his hands, breaking bread over linen. The silence in the room deepens, as though the air itself waits. He eats, he drinks, he mutters words no one repeats, and when he finishes, he steps aside, as if invisible once again. Then the coffin moves on, the earth waiting, the night absorbing every sound, the weight of belief to those gathered. This was not empty ritual. It was survival of the soul. They believed sins might cling like burrs, heavy and sharp, hindering the passage into the afterlife. Without the act of removal, the soul might wander restless, might drift back into the living world. And so the strange duty fell to the outcast. His eating was their relief. His loneliness was their protection. You can almost feel the mixture in the air, grief, fear, faint hope, all folded into silence, broken only by the crunch of crust, the swallow of ale, the midnight grave afterwards. The burial continued, spade against soil, the thud of earth falling, the smell of clay rising. And those who stood around watched more closely now, as though reassured. They believed the danger had passed, that no shadow would rise from the grave, that the body would rest, and the living would sleep lighter. Yet they left with unease. For if the senator had carried away the burden, where did it go? Did it dissolve into air? Or did it sink deeper into him, layer upon layer, until he was little more than a vessel of shadow? Folklore's edge whispers tell that senators themselves were sometimes buried in secret, away from consecrated ground, too dangerous to rest among the faithful, too burdened to lie in sacred soil. Some claimed their graves were shallow, marked only by stones. Others swore their bodies were left in hedgerows, abandoned as they had lived. But even in rejection, there was fear. People spoke of hearing voices around those unmarked places, of feeling cold where the earth dipped. And so, though shunned in life, snitters were remembered in silence after death. Midway, re-anchor reef, you're still listening. Notice how the story slows, like the tolling of a distant bell. You don't have to remember each detail, not the bread, not the lanterns, not the whispers. It is enough to let the rhythm of night, of soil, of silence drift over you. The details fold in like shadows, fading into one another. Communities in the dark, imagine the village as a whole. Each household shuttered tight, each hearth fading, while outside a small group walked the burial path. The rest of the community slept uneasily, trusting that by morning the ritual would be complete. This trust was fragile, but it was shared. Midnight burials and Saniting were not only about the dead, but about keeping the living safe. Fear bound them together, and ritual gave them a way to breathe through it. You can almost hear the quiet ripple of relief at dawn, when the first smoke rose from chimneys again, when doors opened to light, and when silence lifted, if only for a while, shadows that remain today. These customs are gone. Churches no longer call for senators. Midnight burials fade into memory. Yet the stories linger, faint and unsettled, as though part of us still wonders what it meant to walk into darkness with bread and ale, with lantern and spade, trusting that such acts could bind the unseen. The night spreads wide again. You hear the faint rustle of reeds, the hush of air moving across wet ground. And in that hush, you imagine lights rising, not only in valleys of Wales, but across marshes, forests, moors, and fields throughout Europe. Lights without holders, flames without fire. The marsh flames travelers told of wandering lights above marshes pale, wavering glows that darted away when followed, always retreating, just out of reach. Some called them spirits of the dead, some the laughter of trickster beings, others the simple breath of earth itself. But to those who saw them at night, the explanation mattered less than the experience. You feel the unease of stepping onto soft ground, boots sinking, the smell of rot rising, and ahead, a flame that should not be there, bobbing and swaying. Every time you draw near, it drifts farther, teasing, beckoning, leading deeper into emptiness. The fairy flames in Celtic lands. Lights were sometimes thought to be the work of the fair folk, mysterious beings dwelling at the edges of human sight. The flames, they said, were not warnings of death, but invitations, lures meant to lead wanderers astray. A traveler might follow one into hills or hollows, only to find themselves lost until dawn. You imagine that lure now, a flicker of warmth in a dark wood, a glow that promises company, safety, fire, and yet every step toward it feels colder, the forest pressing tighter, the silence growing deeper. Crossroad lantern cells. Tales spoke of phantom lanterns at crossroads, places already heavy with superstition. Crossroads were where suicides were sometimes buried, where offerings were left, where spirits were believed to linger. A lone light seen there at midnight might be a soul unable to rest, or a guide for those who dared walk alone. Picture it, the crunch of gravel beneath your feet, the smell of damp earth, the sudden flare of glow at a crossing. No hand lifts it, no wind stirs it. It stands still, waiting, and when you look away and back again, it has vanished, leaving only the hush of empty road. Midway, re-anchor reef, you're still listening. Notice how the stories drift together, one after another, like lights themselves flickering across the dark. You don't need to hold each tale. You don't need to know where one ends and another begins. Let them move past, soft and slow, like candles burning low in memory. The link to corpse candles in every version, whether marsh, flame, fairy fire, or wandering lantern, the human response was the same, a mixture of fear and wonder. The corpse candle fit within this larger web, a light not natural, not explainable, yet deeply woven into the way people thought about life and death. The lights reminded villagers that death had its signals, that the unseen world pressed close, and though they frightened, they also offered a strange kind of reassurance that endings were not saddened, that shadows announced themselves with flicker before silence fell, fading into reflection. Picture now a vast moor at midnight, dotted with small glows, some drifting like will-o'-the-wisps, some steady like corpse candles. A traveler pauses, breath held, watching them sway across the land. The night presses heavy, the air cold, the silence unbroken, and when the lights vanish one by one, swallowed by mist, the traveler feels the night heavier, yet also softer, as though the earth itself had whispered of what lies ahead, of endings that cannot be escaped, but can at least be seen before they arrive. And so the question lingers in the hush: were these lights born of earth, of marsh and mist, or were they the fragile lanterns of souls, carried briefly across the dark to remind the living of the thin veil they walk upon each night? Asterisk, the first sound is not a voice, but the low hiss of tallow candles. You hear their wax softening, dripping slowly into saucers, as the flame bends against a faint draft. The room is still, though you sense the weight of eyes. The hush of people gathered in solemn watch. The custom was known across Europe, in villages and cities alike. When a person died, the body was not left alone. Relatives, friends, sometimes entire households, remained awake through the night, watching. Some said it was to honor the departed. Others whispered it was to keep away spirits who prowled at the edges of death. You can almost smell the mingling scents: beeswax or tallow, smoke, herbs scattered on the floor to ease the air, linen draped over the still form, chairs drawn close, people whispering prayers, or perhaps not speaking at all, letting silence stretch until it feels endless. The practical reasons there were reasons rooted in earth as well as spirit. Candles gave light, yes, but also served as guardians, burning steadily so no shadow claimed the chamber. Watchers ensured the body was safe from animals, from mishap, from even the faint chance of someone thought dead stirring again. And yet, the practical could not erase the deeper sense that in those hours the dead had not fully departed, that their soul lingered nearby, hovering, listening, waiting. To leave the body unguarded was to risk it being touched by something not meant to enter. The air must have felt heavy then. Every creak of wood, every sudden draft, reminder that the night was never truly empty. The silence of waiting. Imagine yourself there, seated on a hard wooden chair, your eyes fixed on the dim glow of flame. You hear others shifting, a cough held back, the rustle of skirts. Outside, perhaps an owl calls, the sound startling in the hush. Hours pass, the clock ticks, the body remains still, but the stillness itself becomes a weight. You wonder if the eyelids might flutter, if the lips might move, if the chest might draw breath again. Some watchers swore they saw it. A trick of candlelight, perhaps, but enough to stir unease. And so prayers were murmured, psalms repeated, charms whispered words, not only for the dead, but for the living. Steady hearts against the fear of what lingered unseen. The superstition's folklore wound tightly around the vigil. In some places, people believe that if the body were left alone, the devil himself might claim it, or that witches could slip in to steal something of the corpse, a nail, a lock of hair, to use in charms to keep such dangers at bay. Watchers would sometimes place iron objects nearby, or scatter salt, or keep candles burning without pause. Each flicker of flame was a defense, each whispered prayer a shield. You sense how fragile the moment was, a border between two worlds. The body lay quiet, but the soul's passage was not yet secure. The living sat as guardians, their wakefulness a fragile wall against whatever moved in darkness. The emotional weight, but beyond superstition, there was grief. Imagine the weariness of those who had labored all day and yet sat through the night, not willing to abandon the one who lay still. The exhaustion mixed with sorrow, their eyes stinging with smoke, their thoughts wandering between memories and fears. In this way, the vigil became not only protection, but farewell. Time slowed, stretched, blurred, candles shortened, and though dawn always came, the night felt endless, as if it might last forever. Midway reassurance, as if you're still listening. Notice how this watch feels like time itself pausing. You don't need to carry each detail, each image of flame or whispered word. Let them drift past, soft as smoke curling upward, leaving only the calm weight of quiet in your thoughts. Reflection in the hushed picture. Now, the final hour before dawn. The room is dim, the air cold, the wax nearly gone. Watchers shift in their chairs, weary but determined to remain. And still, the body lies silent, a presence both familiar and strange. What thoughts linger then? Do they wonder where the soul has traveled? Do they imagine unseen beings pressing against the walls? Or do they simply sit, their minds empty, content only to keep the flame alive until morning? And so the question hangs, soft, unresolved. Was the vigil for the dead or for the living? A ritual of farewell or a fragile wall against the shadows that press so near? Shadows that press so near. You hear the steady tick of a clock in the corner, marking a night that seems endless. The body lies still, candles flickering, prayers murmured, and yet not all is silence. At times, watchers reached for distraction, filling the hush with whispers, stories, even games. It may seem strange to you now, but in the dimness of medieval and early modern households, the vigil was not always solemn. Neighbors gathered, sometimes entire villages, crowding into the room where the deceased rested. And while grief lingered, like smoke, there was also chatter. Food passed around, and even laughter pressed nervously into the silence. Imagine a platter of bread laid out on a table, a jug of ale or cider being poured into mugs, the sharp tang of onions or salted pork carried on the air. The scent mixes with tallow and smoke, the faint odor of death masked by herbs. A vigil of paradox. The custom had two faces. On one hand, watchers sat as guardians, fearing spirits, dreading the possibility of the body stirring. On the other, the vigil became an occasion for fellowship, for sharing tales, for playing cards or dice. Some historians describe it almost as a carnival in shadow, the presence of death close by, yet the living reminding themselves of life by laughing, talking, by refusing to sink into silence too deeply. You can picture it now. The body draped in linen on one side of the room, the table crowded with neighbors on the other. A candle burns low. Dice rattle softly in a cup. A story is told about a traveler who saw a ghost on the road, and nervous laughter follows. The protective power of distraction. Why such mixing of tones? Some believed that noise and activity themselves could help guard the soul. It's that by staying awake, by keeping minds active, the living kept the dead safe from wandering forces. Others thought that to fall into silence was dangerous. In silence, fear grows, imagination stretches, and shadows seem to move. But in the hum of talk, in the play of games, there is something steady. Something that anchors those who sit in the long night. And so, distraction became ritual. Cards slapped softly onto wood. Dice rolled like small bones across the table. Songs hummed under breath. Folklore of games with the dead in some regions. Superstition crept into the play itself. Dice might be cast for the soul, wagers made in the belief that the dead could bless the outcome. Children of the village sometimes peeked in, half frightened, half fascinated, as elders reminded them that laughter in the presence of death was not disrespect, but balance. The body remained always in sight, though a reminder that life and death were closer than a breath apart. Think of the atmosphere now, a low hum of voices. Laughter, too loud because it pushes against fear, the clatter of cups, and behind it, always, the still form on the bed, unmoving, a silence deeper than all the noise combined. Food, drink, and the easing of grief. Food was a constant. Bread, broken and shared. Ale, passed around. In Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England. The wake grew from these vigils, named for the very act of staying awake. Food soothed hunger. Yes, but also anchored those who sat through the night. It gave comfort when grief hollowed the stomach, and it filled the time. And sometimes, offerings of food or drink were set aside for the dead themselves, as if their spirit might be lingering, hungry too. The smell of roasting meat might drift through the chamber, a pie cooling, the faint sweetness of honey cakes, all against the odor of smoke and wax, and the bitter edge of sorrow, the blurring of sacred and profane. What fascinates you most is how blurred it all became. Sacred prayers whispered beside murmured jokes, dice thrown beside psalms recited, a child asleep in the lap of a mourner, while another plays with scraps of wax peeled from a candle. To the medieval mind, there was no contradiction. Life and death sat side by side. To honor the dead was also to honor the living, to keep them steady, to remind them that the world still turned, even as grief pressed close. And so, vigils were both ritual and release. Fear and laughter bound together in a single night. Midway, reassurance, so if you're still listening. Let the sound of these vigils drift through your thoughts. You don't need to keep every detail, every word of dice or laughter. It is enough to imagine the low murmur of voices, the glow of candles, the weight of the body in the corner. The rest can fade, soft and easy, into the background. Reflection in a half-lightened yet, as dawn neared, laughter quieted, games slowed, eyes turned again toward the body. Candles had burned short, their wax puddled thick. The air felt heavier, as if the room itself remembered why they were gathered in those hours. The vigil revealed its true heart, a fragile defiance against sorrow, a reminder that life stirs even in the presence of death. But one question remains, lingering as soft as a final breath. Was the laughter a way to protect the soul of the dead, or only a shield to protect the hearts of the living? Asterisk. You hear the faintest shift of sound, the slow creak of benches, the low murmur of voices drawing down as if the night itself were sighing. Candles gutter in their sockets, their flames small, weary, nearly drowned in their own wax. The vigil is ending. A pale seam of light presses at the shutters. Outside, the frost of dawn has formed on every branch, and the air hangs still, waiting. You can imagine the mourners stirring after hours of wakefulness, stiff, tired, eyes ringed with the shadows of sleeplessness. Some lift cups for the last time, draining the last of the ale. Others whisper a final prayer, and all turn slowly toward the body, for the time has come to carry it into the world beyond the house. The first steps into mourning. You hear the rustle of linen as the shroud is straightened. A candle is lifted, its flame fragile yet guiding. The room seems to expand with silence as the bearers approach. Each step heavy, deliberate, as if the floor itself groans beneath the weight of passage. In many places, the body was turned 3 times in the doorway before leaving. The reason was always whispered, never entirely clear. Some said it confused the spirit, preventing it from finding its way back into the house. Others believed it confounded darker forces, those that lingered at thresholds, waiting for the moment of transition. And so, the body spun slowly, once, twice, thrice, the sound of boots shifting, of boards creaking, of cloth brushing stone. Then, at last, the door opened, and the gray air of morning spilled in. The world beyond the door. Imagine stepping outside then. The cold strikes at your skin, sharper after the closeness of the vigil room. The sky is low, pale, with a smear of pink at the horizon. Smoke curls from chimneys, faint against the air, carrying the bittersweet scent of damp wood and ash. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then falls silent. The coffin, if there was one, is plain wood, dark and heavy. More often in the poorer households, it was only a board, a bier draped in linen, the body carried with solemn effort. And as they walked, bells tolled, slow, echoing, stretching each note into the stillness of morning. Each toll seemed to weigh on the chest of every listener. In villages, the sound rolled across fields, brushing frost, startling rooks from the hedges. In towns, it bounced from stone to stone, a low moan that seemed to make the very streets shiver. The walking of the route mattered. Some paths were avoided, others required. In parts of England and Wales, bodies were carried along corpse roads, ancient tracks that cut across meadows and woods, believed to be the true paths of souls. These ways were lined with lore, crossroads where spirits might wander, standing stones where the dead might pause, streams where water marked the divide between worlds. You hear boots crunching frost. You see breath clouding in the cold. The weight of the body is borne in silence, though sometimes a psalm is murmured, voices wavering, rising and falling like the tide. At certain points, the procession might stop. Here, a stone cross, worn by centuries of weather, offered a place to rest. Here, a field edge where the wind sang loud in the grass, the bearers shifted their grip, okay, and all the while, the watchers' eyes drifted toward the form in linen, waiting, wondering, imagining the journey that continued beyond their sight. The roll of bells and praise bells tolled not only at the church, but sometimes along the way. A boy might be tasked with ringing a handbell as the mourners approached, its thin clang breaking the quiet. The sound was thought to drive away spirits, who might linger too near the soul, greedy to pull it astray. Prayers, too, accompanied each step, Latin verses, half muttered, half forgotten by those who repeated them out of habit. In Protestant times, psalms replaced these simple lines sung softly into the air. Their rhythm steadied the walk, each word a tether between the living and the dead. And yet, silence always returned. Silence thicker than speech. It's a kind of silence where each person could hear the blood moving in their ears, the crackle of frost beneath the foot, the occasional rustle of crow's wings above. Asterisk approaching. The churchyard at last. The procession turned toward the churchyard, its low stone walls marking the boundary between common ground and sacred space. You picture it, the gate creaking open, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and moss. The grass sparkled with frost, blades bent beneath the weight of morning dew. This was the heart of the ritual, the place where all fears converged. For if the soul was to rest, it must lie in consecrated ground. Without it, the dead might wander. And so, the grave awaited, dark, damp, soil piled at its side, a spade jutting up like a marker. Sometimes, the priest stood ready. Other times, he arrived late, the mourners already gathered in uneasy silence. The prayers began, weaving Latin or English into the still air, their syllables long, droning, fading against stone and sky. Folklore of thresholds at the churchyard gate. Many customs clustered. Some placed coins upon the coffin, offerings for the journey. Others sprinkled salt, thought to purify, to keep corruption at bay. And still others struck the bier lightly against the ground, to remind the soul of its weight, or perhaps to shake off clinging spirits. Even here, at the edge of burial, superstition held strong. A sneeze might be taken as an omen. A raven's cry at the wrong moment sent shivers through the crowd. All paused, waiting, till the sign passed and the ritual could go on, lowering into the earth. And then the ropes creaked. The body descended. The earth opened to receive. The smell of soil rose strong, damp, rich, with a scent both ancient and raw. You can almost feel the cold grains between your fingers. The heaviness of the spade each mourner might cast in a handful of earth. The thud of clods echoed in the grave, deep, hollow, final. And yet, even this moment was softened by ritual words, by prayers meant to ease the heart. Sometimes herbs were scattered to rosemary for remembrance, thyme for purity, bay leaves for eternity. Their fragrance mixed with the smell of earth, creating a strange sweetness over the open grave. The lingering of the living, but even after burial, the watch was not over. Some lingered, unwilling to leave. They stood in silence, their breath pale against the morning air, staring at the mound of soil. Others turned quickly away, too heavy with grief, and still, whispers told of what might happen if things were not done properly. That the dead might rise, restless, that the soul might wander, knocking at windows, scratching at doors. And so, stones were placed, crosses raised, prayers whispered again and again, as if to fold the dead firmly into their rest. Midway, reassurance, as if you're still listening now. Let yourself drift with these images. You don't need to carry every detail, every sound of bells, every clod of earth. It's enough to feel the rhythm of the walk, the slow toll of the bell, the gray of dawn spreading. You can let the rest flow past, like water down a quiet stream. Reflection in the hush of mourning. The procession fades. The mourners scatter. The churchyard grows still again. Crows wheel overhead, their calls harsh against the silence. A cold wind moves through the grass, bending it low, carrying the smell of fresh turned soil. And somewhere, the house now empty of its body, candles still gutter in their sockets. The room holds a memory of breath, of whispers, of laughter and sorrow woven together. As you imagine this, one question lingers softly, refusing to settle when they walked away from the grave, leaving earth and stone behind. Did they truly believe the soul had gone, or did they always half expect to meet it again, somewhere on the road home? Asterisk, you hear the hush of night again. Not England now, not the frostbound lanes of Yorkshire or the candlelit chambers of London, but elsewhere. Imagine the warm breath of a southern wind, the chirp of unseen insects in grass, the scent of resinous wood burning faintly somewhere far. The setting changes, yet the atmosphere remains. The quiet passage of the dead beneath the cover of darkness. Burials in the Carpathian. Dusk, you find yourself walking a narrow track in the Carpathian hills. It is dusk, though it feels like midnight, for the forest crowds close, its branches interlaced like a roof. The people here whispered of Strigway, restless souls that rose from graves, pale and hungry. And so, burials were timed to confuse them. At midnight, when no rooster crowed, when no prayer bells sounded, the villagers carried their dead. The earth here was dark, damp, heavy with the smell of loam. Fires burned at the edge of the village, their smoke pungent with juniper and herbs. As the coffin passed, sparks rose and drifted upward, like small, wandering souls themselves. You hear footsteps crunch on gravel, the creak of the bier, the whispered sound of charms spoken against the night. And you feel, in the closeness of that forest, how pressing the unseen could be. The Mediterranean midnight tells where. Along the rocky coasts of the Mediterranean, the air smelled of salt, and the sea lay black and glassy under starlight. Here, burials sometimes happened beneath the stars, because the heat of day was unbearable, and the night was cooler, more solemn, more forgiving. You hear the waves breaking softly, a rhythm almost like breath. Lanterns swung on long poles, their flames reflected in the water, casting trembling paths of light. The mourners moved slowly toward a hillside chapel, their robes brushing dust, their sandals crunching pebbles. Prayers in Greek or Latin drifted upward, each syllable soft against the waves. And always, the sea seemed to listen. Some believed it carried the voices of the dead, just as it carried the bodies of sailors far from shore. Desert shadows. Now picture the desert, where burial under night skies was both custom and necessity. The day's heat was too fierce, the sands too searing, the air too heavy. So the dead were carried at midnight when the wind cooled, and stars shone so bright they seemed to burn. The sand whispered under feet. The body, wrapped in cloth, was lowered into a grave, dug swiftly by lamplight. Incense smoldered, sharp and resinous, curling into the dark. And all around, the silence was vast, broken only by the howl of a jackal. Then, lonely, distant, here too, fears lingered, that the desert itself swallowed spirits, that winds carried whispers of the dead, scattering them into the endless night. The echoes of ASEAN Asia. In villages of China, midnight burials sometimes entwined with geomancy. The body could not be laid to rest until the stars and land aligned, and so families waited, holding their dead in shadowed rooms. While masters of feng shui read the heavens, you hear the scrape of bamboo slips, the mutter of calculations, the faint jingle of charms. And then, at a chosen hour, often midnight, the family moved, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the mist. Paper offerings burned, the crackle sharp, the ash rising and scattering. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, hair, skin. The grave was filled, but the fire never ceased. It was fed with tokens of money, houses, clothes, so that the dead might walk into the afterlife well-progeny. And in the distance, a rooster crowed too early, its voice ragged, trembling, and all fell silent, for that cry, out of place, was thought to be a warning. Midway reassurance, if you're still here, still drifting with me. Notice how time feels slower now. You don't have to remember each custom, each ritual of fire, salt, or silence. It's enough to let them drift past, like shadows across water. Your mind can loosen as the night itself loosens, tying the tight knots of memory. The universal fear different lands, different customs. Yet one thing repeats, again and again, the fear that death might not end at burial, that something might linger, restless, unsatisfied, hungry. And so, midnight became the chosen hour, not only because it was quiet, not only because the air was still, but because it was the hour when the world felt most uncertain, most fragile, most open to both spirit and shadow. You hear it in the bells, in the silence, in the whispered words. You feel it in the chill of soil, in the smoke of herbs, in the flutter of bird wings startled from a branch. Reflection in shadows, so many cultures, so many ways of guiding the dead. And yet, as dawn always followed, the question never fully resolved. Did the dead truly rest? Did the living truly believe the rites were enough? Even now, if you imagine walking home from such a midnight burial, the path long, the shadows deep, the trees leaning close, can you ever be sure that the silence behind you is only silence, or something more? Asterisk, the night is quiet once again. You hear nothing at first, only the faint brush of wind across the ground. And then, somewhere, a door creaks, a sound like wood sighing, a sound that might be ordinary or not, for those who lived in centuries past. The silence after a midnight burial was rarely trusted. Shadows at the threshold, villages from the Carpathians to the marshes of England. Families told stories of shadows that lingered outside thresholds after a body was buried at midnight. Sometimes they claimed to hear footsteps in frost, though no one walked the lane. At other times, the latch of a door shifted softly, as though someone unseen leaned against it. You imagine standing there in a wooden cottage, your fire guttering low. Outside, the mist presses against a small window. Inside, you hold your breath, listening. And in the weight of that silence, you feel why these tales took root. The watchers in fields in Yorkshire and further north. Farmers sometimes refused to cross their fields after midnight burials. They spoke of pale lights, hovering low, moving as if held by unseen hands. To some, they were corpse candles, omens that the dead had not fully settled. To others, they were simply marsh gas flames, rising natural and strange from wet soil. But imagine walking there yourself, lantern in hand. The cold, damp air clings to your cloak. You see the faint flicker of light across the furrows. The soil smells raw, freshly turned, and you remember the burial that happened only nights before. Can you be certain the glow is only earth-breathing gas and not something else? Breathing gas and not something else? The haunting of sounded was not always sight that troubled him. More often, it was sound. Low knocking against a wall when no hand was there. The soft fall of feet on stairs long after the last person had climbed them. The whisper of a name in the dark. You hear it now, don't you? Not clearly, not enough to form words, but a murmur, faint as wind, curling in the corners of the room. You imagine why people, exhausted by grief, might believe their dead had not yet gone. Reassuring Sif, you're still listening. Remember, you don't need to hold on to every tale. Let them drift past like smoke from a dying fire. It's enough to rest inside the rhythm, to hear the echoes without needing to follow them. Folklore of returning Southern Europe. They whispered of the revenant, the one who returned after midnight burial, walking silently back toward home. Sometimes he entered, seating himself at the table, staring without eating. Sometimes he only lingered outside, pressing against walls. A shadow where no shadow should fall. The living tried to confuse these revenants. Graves were dug deep, or turned sideways, or scattered with salt and herbs. Sometimes the body was wrapped with knots, impossible to untie, because spirits were thought to stumble over knots, unable to pass them. Picture it, the grave, cold and wet, the shroud bound carefully with threads, the knots tied one after another, as if each twist of cord could hold death firmly in its place. The uneasy silence and, yet, despite such care, silence was never fully trusted. That is why the midnight burial lingered. By sending the dead away in the darkest hour, the living believed they stole them into a silence already thick, already empty, hoping the spirits would be too weary to return. But if the silence broke, if a dog barked suddenly, or a bird cried in the night, fear rose sharp, for it meant, perhaps, that something was moving again. Something unseen. Reflection, you notice, as you drift through these tales, how alike they feel, though separated by mountains, rivers, oceans. Always the same thread, that the living were not alone in their grief, that something else pressed close. That midnight was not only an hour of burial, but of vigilance, and you wonder when the mist folds around you, when the earth feels damp beneath your feet, when shadows seem thicker than they should. Are you hearing only the night, or the faint steps of those who were meant to rest? The night presses in once more. You hear the faint toll of a distant bell, muffled by fog. The sound is slow, weighted, as though it drifts from another century. And you remember, bells were always tied to death. Their toll meant to carry a soul safely across, but not always did the bell ring in midnight burials. Silence itself was the bell, the church and its struggle for much of the medieval period. The church struggled with the quiet power of local customs. Priests urged daylight burials, proper rituals, candles lit in holy places. Yet families often resisted. They had their reasons: fear of restless dead, fear of curses, fear of spirits that could not find rest if buried by day. Imagine a priest standing by the lich gate, his lantern flickering against his cloak. He argues softly with villagers who clutch the shrouded body, unwilling to wait for morning. He insists on order. They insist on safety. And so the midnight burial continues, beyond law, beyond doctrine, carried by fear more ancient than scripture. Candles hidden, candles revealed. Sometimes candles were lit, sometimes hooded, sometimes extinguished at the grave. A flicker meant guidance. A snuffed flame meant severing ties. You picture it now, wax melting in the cold air, the faint scent of tallow drifting into night. Fingers shield the flame, shadows shift across faces, and then darkness swallows the light, as though the world itself has chosen to forget. Re-anchoreth, you're still awake. Notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to recall every turn of belief, every strange practice. It's enough to let the rhythm of voices long gone wash through you, like waves lapping quietly against the shore. The law of silence by the late Middle Ages. Some towns outlawed midnight burials entirely. Too many fears, too many rumors. A dog barking at night could start whispers of reverence. A child's illness might be blamed on a grave dug under moonlight. To quiet the fear, authorities decreed burials must be done in daylight. But laws never erase memory. Families remembered the whispers, and so, even after the practice faded, they tied knots in funeral cloths, or slipped coins to the dead, or scattered herbs at thresholds. Shadows of midnight ritual carried into daylight, lingering in folklore centuries later. Writers collected these stories. They found them in whispers of peasants, in parish records, in strange laws that seemed to guard against things unnamed. They found mentions of graveyards where no birds sang, of shrouds stitched without knots, of salt poured heavy across thresholds. You hear them too, don't you? Not clearly, but as if voices still echo under the soil, repeating what must not be forgotten, reflectioning so the midnight burial passes into memory, but the feeling lingers. The sense that night has a weight, that silence holds more than emptiness, that grief presses against walls long after the body is laid to rest. You imagine it now, standing in the cold, listening, watching. The earth is quiet, the sky is dark. Yet you ask yourself softly, when the hour turns to midnight, when the grave has just closed, is the silence around you only silence? Or is it the echo of footsteps that were never meant to return, Perhaps it was never about banishing fear entirely, but about containing it, giving shape to the unknowns so that it could be carried, if not erased. And as you picture the churchyard once more, mist curling low across stone, you might wonder softly, did the night truly close over the dead? Or did it close more gently over the living, who needed the silence to believe the world was safe again? Asterisk, the night is heavy with stillness. You hear nothing at first but the soft rustle of trees, the faint hiss of wind slipping low across grass. Then, out of the dark, a glimmer appears. Small at first, like a candle cupped in unseen hands, wavering against the emptiness. You draw closer in imagination. The light floats low to the ground, pale and unsteady, moving as though guided by breath. It is not flame, not lantern. It has no source you can name. Yet villagers called it by many names: the corpse candle, the death light, the silent herald, the omen for those who lived in the borderlands of Wales, in the valleys and along the moors. The sight of such a light was no small thing. Folklore told that it drifted along the path a coffin would one day take, moving ahead of time, tracing the journey before death arrived. Some swore they had seen the lights pause at doorways, lingering where a body would later be carried out. Others whispered that the color of the flame foretold age: a small, pale blue light for a child, a larger, redder glow for an adult. You imagine now the dread of seeing such a glow outside your cottage, flickering in the blackness of night. The hair on your arms would rise, your breath slow, your voice caught. To see it meant inevitability, not possibility. It was not a question of if, but when. The silence around it, the strange thing about corpse candles, was not only their glow, but the silence that wrapped them. No sound of footfall, no rustle of cloth, only the faint movement of air, as though the world hushed itself in their presence. Dogs often refused to bark, horses shifted restlessly, owls fell still, and this silence pressed so deep that those who witnessed it carried the memory for life. You hear that hush now, layered into your own listening, a stillness inside, stillness, heavy and complete, belief and fear. Why did people believe so strongly? In part, because the lights often coincided with real events. A villager might see one on a lonely track, and days later, a funeral passed the same way. A glow lingered by a gate, and within a week, someone in that household lay under a shroud. Coincidence, perhaps, or a trick of marsh gases, some might say. But to those who lived close to earth and dark, it was proof of something deeper, something beyond explanation. And so, corpse candles became both omen and comfort. If death must come, at least it was known. At least the path was lit. The human response, you imagine the reactions. Some would cross themselves quickly and shut the shutters tight. Others would watch longer, mesmerized, as though needing to see where the light would go. A few, braver or more curious, followed, walking behind the glow as it drifted toward a churchyard, their breath clouding in the cold, hearts heavy with dread. But none dared to interfere. No hand reached to grasp it. No voice called out. The corpse candle was left to move in silence, its journey unbroken. Midway reassurance, if you're still listening, notice how the rhythm has slowed again. You don't have to hold on to the names or the details. It is enough to drift with the image of a lone light in the dark, swaying gently, fading and returning. You don't have to explain it. You can let it pass like a lantern slipping out of view. The deeper meaning corpse candles, though eerie, reflected a deeper need, the desire to make sense of death, to soften its edge by giving it warning. In a world where illness struck suddenly, where life was uncertain, people found comfort in imagining a signal, something that prepared the living for loss. It was not only about fear, it was also about readiness, about being able to gather, to grieve, to pray before the final moment. The light was uncanny, but it was also merciful, a drifting reflection picture, again the more at night. The grass bent with wind, the path empty. Then, just above the ground, a light stirs. It flickers, pauses, glides forward, as though unseen hands bear it along. No one speaks, no one follows, and when it fades, the darkness feels heavier, the silence deeper. And so the question lingers, soft and unresolved. Were corpse candles true heralds of death, or were they only the reflections of human fear, glowing back against the night? The air is damp again in your mind, the sky low, heavy with cloud. You hear only your own footsteps, faint and muffled on the soft path. And then it comes, a pale gleam ahead, wavering, moving where no torch should be. This was how many told it. The sudden sight of a light that no hand held, a glow that seemed to float just above the earth, always tracing the same routes that mourners would later take. A tale by the river, one story, tells of a farmer returning late, his boots heavy with mud, the river beside him swollen with rain. In the dark, he noticed a shimmer, as though a candle bobbed upon the water's surface. It moved slowly, keeping pace with him, sometimes flickering, sometimes glowing steady. When he stopped, it stopped. When he walked, it followed. Days later, a coffin was borne along that very bank, carried toward the church on the hill. The farmer said little, but when others whispered of the light, he nodded only once, his face pale, his eyes lowered. You can almost feel the stillness of that moment, water sliding black, reeds whispering faintly, and above it all, a flame with no wick, no source, drifting toward an unseen destination. A doorway vigil in another valley. An old woman swore she saw a glow pause outside her neighbor's cottage. It hovered just above the ground, as though resting at the threshold, flickering against the wood of the door. She watched from her own window, breath fogging the glass, unable to look away. 3 nights later, her neighbor was dead, and the coffin passed out through that very doorway. The villagers said the corpse candle had been keeping vigil, marking the passage before it came. You imagine her gaze at the window, the silence pressing tight, the faint smell of smoke in her room, the way her fingers curled against the sill as the glow lingered and then slipped away. Over the hills, some spoke of corpse candles that traveled farther, winding along hillsides or crossing wide fields. They seemed to know the path, even before it was walked. Men returning from taverns whispered of following them from a distance, their own lanterns dim compared to the steady glow of the phantom flame. And when a funeral later traced that same path, they said the match was perfect. Every bend, every rise, every pause, as though the light had walked the journey ahead of time. You feel it now, the cold slope beneath your feet, the hush of grass moving in night air. It's the sight of a light gliding steadily forward, uncaring of wind or stone. Midway, re-anchor, if you're still listening. Notice how slowly the images drift by. You don't need to keep each tale fixed in your mind. You don't need to remember which valley, which river, which doorway. It is enough to let them pass like lights themselves, appearing, lingering, fading. The rhythm is what carries you, not the detail. The watcher's burden, what must it have felt like to see such a thing? To know in your bones what it meant, yet be powerless to change it. Many said they felt their bodies go cold, their voices fail. Few dared to tell the family for fear of hastening grief. Instead, they kept the knowledge to themselves, carrying it like a heavy stone in silence. Imagine that burden, the sound of a loved one's laughter the next day, the sight of them working, living, breathing, while you alone knew their path was already marked by light. Blurred boundaries in some regions, the corpse candle was not feared, but accepted. It was a sign, not of horror, but of order, that death had its course, that no one left unmarked. To see the light was to glimpse the thread of fate itself, glowing faint against the night. And so people walked on, shutters closed, eyes lowered. The light did what it must, and they returned to their homes, to their hearts. Try not to think of what morning might bring. A drifting reflection picture, the Morrigan, wide and empty, with mist curling low. A faint glow sways across it, moving slow, steady, patient. No one follows, no one dares disturb it. And when it vanishes into the distance, the night folds in heavier than before, the silence pressing down like snow. And you wonder quietly, as those villagers once did, was the corpse candle truly a herald of death? Or was it simply the living heart's way of shaping fear into light? Heart's way of shaping fear into light?